kind of strange, right? Like how we're horrified by serial killers, but also kind of fascinated by them at the same time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I get that.
So for this deep dive, we're going to explore that a little bit as we dig into some excerpts from Understanding Serial Killers, Psychology, Biology, and Motivations. It's a pretty dense book.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to try to extract the key takeaways for you.
I think that's really what draws people in, right? Is that desire to understand, like, why? Why would somebody do these horrible things? And I think, maybe even find a way to prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. And to do that, we got to go beyond the headlines and stuff, the sensationalized stuff,
Yeah.
and really look at all the factors that go into making a serial killer. We're going to be talking about psychology, biology, motivations, and even the role that society plays in shaping our perceptions. So are you ready to take a little journey into the dark side of the human psyche?
I am. Let's do it. Okay. So this book starts by painting a pretty chilling picture of the psychology of a serial killer. It talks about, a lack of remorse, an inflated sense of self-worth, and a constant need for dominance. It's almost like they're operating on a completely different moral compass.
Yeah, and it's important to clarify, too. I think that there are different categories within that, that psychological framework. The book goes into the distinction between psychopathy and sociopathy. And those are two terms that often get used interchangeably.
Right.
But they have very distinct origins.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that it points to two different pathways to this kind of darkness.
So what's the current thinking on psychopathy? Is it nature or nurture? Or a little bit of both?
Well, research suggests that psychopathy may be rooted in brain abnormalities.
Oh.
Specifically in areas that control empathy and impulse control.
Oh.
And these individuals can present as incredibly charming.
Oh, really?
And manipulate. Right. So they use their charisma to gain trust and then manipulate others. The book uses Ted Bundy as a prime example. He lured victims with that carefully crafted persona of charm and normalcy.
That calculated charm is almost more terrifying than outright aggression. Right?
It definitely makes it more complex.
Yeah, yeah.
Adds a layer of complexity to their danger. On the other hand, sociopathy seems to be influenced a lot more by environmental factors.
Okay.
Things like childhood trauma, neglect, exposure to violence. Those are all considered huge contributors to the development of those sociopathic traits. These individuals can be impulsive and they struggle to form meaningful connections.
Okay.
The book gives the example of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Right.
And his brutal, seemingly random acts of violence.
Yeah, very different.
Right, very different.
Yeah, it's interesting how it contrasts those two profiles.
Yeah.
And really highlights that there isn't a single serial killer blueprint,
Exactly.
But speaking of origins, the book also spends a lot of time talking about childhood trauma as a potential breeding ground for this kind of darkness.
Yeah, you can't really shy away from that, right? It's an important piece.
Yeah.
And as uncomfortable as it might be, the book argues that severe childhood trauma, things like abuse, neglect, or even witnessing extreme violence, that can leave lasting scars on a young mind.
For sure.
And the consequences of that can be really profound, affect emotional development, their coping mechanisms, even their ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality.
So it's not even just the event itself, it's the ripple effect it has on a developing psyche, right?
Yes, exactly.
Almost like a chain reaction.
Exactly.
Leading to a very distorted worldview.
Yes, very much so. And the book highlights this potential development of emotional detachment, as a defense mechanism against further pain. Imagine a child experiences such intense hurt that they basically just shut down emotionally.
Wow.
As a way to protect themselves.
Yeah, I can see that.
And that detachment can then make it easier to inflict pain on others.
Oh.
Without experiencing those normal feelings of guilt or remorse.
Right. And then there's the idea of fantasy as an escape, which, can be healthy to an extent, but in these cases, that line between fantasy and reality can become blurred. And violent fantasies can become a coping mechanism. Does the book go into how that happens, that blurring?
It does touch on the McDonald triad, which is a somewhat controversial theory.
Okay.
Linking bedwetting, cruelty to animals, and fire setting in childhood to potential violent tendencies later in life. And I think it's really crucial for your listeners to understand that this triad is not a definitive predictor.
Right.
But it is a potential red flag that, when combined with other factors, might warrant further investigation.
So it's more about recognizing patterns and risk factors than labeling every kid who, wets the bed as a future serial killer.
Exactly. It's about understanding the complexity of these issues
Right.
and approaching them with nuance. Now we've talked about the psychological framework, the potential impact of early experiences. What about the physical aspects?
Right.
What's happening in the brain of a serial killer?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. The book talks about brain abnormalities and how they might play a role in shaping a serial killer's mindset. And it talks about how brain scans often reveal key differences
Yeah.
in the brains of serial killers compared to the general population.
Is there a serial killer brain?
Right, right. And it's not as simple as saying like, oh, this is the serial killer brain. But research has pointed to consistent abnormalities in certain areas, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Okay.
So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functions, things like decision-making, impulse control, planning, all that good stuff. And in serial killers, this area often shows reduced activity or structural abnormalities, which could impair their ability to regulate impulses and make sound judgments. So they might understand the consequences of their actions, but they just have a harder time controlling that urge.
Yeah, like a car with faulty brakes.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
And then you have the amygdala, which plays a crucial role in processing emotions,
Okay.
especially fear and empathy. And in many serial killers, the amygdala shows reduced activity, suggesting a blunted emotional response
Oh, wow.
to fear and suffering in others.
So they don't experience the same level of distress
Potentially not.
when they inflict pain as someone with a normally functioning amygdala.
Exactly. It's a chilling thought, right?
Right.
That someone could detach so completely
Yeah.
from the human cost of their actions.
It's scary. And the book doesn't stop there. It even goes into hormones
Oh, yeah.
and their potential link to aggression. It mentions studies that found correlations between high testosterone levels and low serotonin levels with increased aggression in serial killers.
That's right.
So are we talking about a biological predisposition to violence? Is it nature versus nurture, or is it what is it? It's rarely one or the other, right? It's more like a complex interplay of genetic predispositions and environmental influences. The book even touches on the warrior gene, a genetic variant that's been linked to increased aggression and impulsivity.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that, the warrior gene. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and how it might play a role here?
Yeah, sure. So it's a variant of a gene called MAOA, which is involved in breaking down neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. This particular variant, the warrior gene, has been linked to lower MAOA activity,
Okay.
which in turn can lead to higher levels of those neurotransmitters and a heightened sensitivity to threat and provocation. Now, having this gene variant doesn't automatically make someone violent.
Right.
But when combined with other risk factors like childhood trauma or substance abuse, it could increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior.
So it's like having a loaded gun. It's dangerous.
Yes.
But it takes a trigger to make it fire.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And that's the key takeaway here, right? It's understanding that complex interplay of genetics, brain function, and environmental factors that contribute to the development of violent tendencies. It's rarely a simple equation. And there's still much we don't understand.
So we've explored the psychology, we've explored the biology, but now let's get to the why.
Yeah.
Like, what are the motives that drive these individuals to kill?
Right. And that's where things get really interesting, I think, because the book emphasizes that serial killers are not a homogenous group, right? They have different motivations, different methods, and even their motives can shift over time.
So it's not just about a bloodlust or just like a desire to kill. There's like deeper psychological forces at play.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the book outlines 4 main types of serial killers.
Okay.
Each with distinct motivating factors. Are you ready to unpack those?
Yeah, let's do it. I think our listeners are ready too.
Okay, great. So first, we have what are called the visionary killers.
Visionary kill.
And these individuals are driven by delusions or hallucinations, or even what they perceive as commands from a higher power. So they feel compelled to kill based on these really distorted beliefs.
So it's almost like they're on a twisted divine mission.
Exactly.
Only they understand, you know?
Yes, very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
The book gives the example of Herbert Mullen, who believed that his murders were preventing earthquakes.
Oh my God.
So he felt justified, even righteous,
wow.
in his actions.
It's really a stark reminder that reality is subjective.
Yeah,
And for some, that subjective reality can be really dangerous.
absolutely.
Okay, so what's the next type?
Next, we have the mission-oriented killers.
Mission-oriented, okay.
And these individuals feel a self-imposed duty to rid the world of certain types of people.
Wow.
They might target specific groups based on their own, warped ideology,
Okay.
seeing themselves as cleansers of society.
So it's less about personal gain and more about upholding some kind of twisted sense of justice.
Exactly, yeah.
Like they're on a crusade to purify the world,
Yes.
according to their own warped worldview.
Exactly. Think of Jack the Ripper, right?
Yeah.
And his targeting of prostitutes in 19th century London,
Right.
he believed that he was doing society a favor
Oh my God.
by eliminating what he saw as like a corrupt element.
Wow. It's fascinating and horrifying at the same time.
It is, right.
To see how these justifications take root,
Yeah.
Okay, so what other types are there?
All right. Then we have the hedonistic killers.
Hedonistic, okay.
And these guys are driven by the pleasure or thrill derived from the act of killing itself.
Okay.
Their motivations might stem from lust, a
Hmm.
craving for power and control, or even financial gain.
So this is where someone like Ted Bundy fits in.
Yes, exactly.
His crimes were largely fueled by a desire for sexual gratification
Yes.
and control over his victims.
Yeah, you got it.
It just shows how these primal urges, like lust and aggression, can become so dangerously intertwined,
Yeah.
leading to these horrifying acts.
It's a stark reminder that even the darkest impulses can find a foothold, right?
Yeah.
In the human psyche.
All right, so what's the final type?
Last but certainly not least, we have the power control killers.
Power control, okay.
As the name suggests, their primary motivation is the need to exert absolute dominance and instill fear in their victims. It's not so much about the act of killing itself, but the sense of power and control that they derive from it.
So for them, the kill is almost secondary to the psychological domination that they're craving.
Yes, exactly. They want to completely break their victims, both physically and emotionally.
Wow. The book uses Jeffrey Dahmer as an example, right?
Yeah.
Highlighting his desire for complete control over his victims.
Yes.
Even engaging in necrophilia and cannibalism
Right.
as a way to extend that control beyond death.
It's a really disturbing example.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of depravity.
It is.
It really underscores the darkest depths of human behavior.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that a killer's motives might not always fit neatly into one category.
No, for sure.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's not always so clear-cut.
No, these are just like starting points, right?
Okay.
A killer might exhibit traits from multiple types, and their motives could evolve over time.
Gotcha.
It's not a simple equation.
Right. And there's another layer to this puzzle that we need to consider. The role of society, and particularly the media, in shaping our perceptions of serial killers. Okay, now that's an interesting angle. We live in a world that's obsessed with true crime, right? Podcasts, documentaries, books.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, serial killers have become a mainstream topic of fascination.
For sure. And the book brings up a really important point, that the media often plays a role in glorifying these individuals, turning them into anti-heroes, even celebrities.
It's almost like they become larger-than-life figures.
Right.
Their faces plastered on magazine covers, their stories turned into movies. Does that create a dangerous feedback loop, making them more alluring to certain individuals?
It's definitely a concern, yeah. By sensationalizing their crimes, we risk creating a morbid fascination.
Right.
Even a disturbing level of fandom. Think of Charles Manson, right?
Oh, yeah.
And his devoted followers who saw him as a guru, a revolutionary figure.
Yeah, that's a chilling example of how the line between notoriety and infamy can become blurred. So it raises the question, why are we so drawn to the darkness?
Right.
What fuels this enduring fascination with serial killers? Is it morbid curiosity?
I think there are several factors at play. One is just that primal instinct for self-preservation.
Okay.
We're drawn to understanding evil.
Right.
Perhaps because we believe it will help us avoid becoming victims ourselves.
It's like we're trying to learn the predator's playbook.
Yeah.
So we can anticipate their moves.
Exactly right. And then there's the psychological puzzle aspect.
Yeah.
We want to understand their motives, crack the code of their minds, decipher what makes them tick.
Right. And the media certainly feeds that desire.
Yeah.
Right. With endless analyses and profiles trying to unravel the mystery of the serial killer mind.
Absolutely. It's become an industry unto itself.
Yeah.
You know, all this makes me wonder.
It makes you wonder what?
If a serial killer is ultimately a product of their environment, their experiences, their biology, Does that make them any less responsible for their actions?
Whoa, that's a big question to unpack.
It is, right.
It's like the age-old nature versus nurture debate taken to an extreme.
Exactly. If their brains are wired differently, if they've experienced horrific trauma that shaped their development,
Right.
can we truly hold them accountable in the same way as someone who seemingly chooses to commit a crime?
It's a moral and ethical minefield for sure.
It is, absolutely. Because on one hand, you have the victims and their families who have suffered unimaginable loss. They deserve justice. Absolutely.
But on the other hand, if we acknowledge that these individuals are, in a sense, victims themselves
Right.
of circumstantial biology,
Yeah.
does that change how we approach rehabilitation, punishment, even prevention?
Right. That's the question.
It's a question that really challenges our fundamental understanding of free will and responsibility.
It does.
Wow.
And it's a question we'll be exploring further as we continue our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now, I think it's important for your listeners to just reflect on what we've covered so far.
Hmm.
Think about that complex interplay of factors that contribute to the making of a serial killer, and consider how those factors might shape our understanding of their motives and ultimately their culpability.
Okay.
Yeah, it really makes you think about like the nature of evil, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And, as we continue this deep dive, I keep coming back to this idea that the human mind is like this incredibly complex thing. We're capable of so much love and compassion and creativity, but we also have this capacity for darkness and cruelty and violence. It's like there's this constant battle going on within us all.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. And I think that's really what makes this topic so fascinating, but also so disturbing. Because when we look at serial killers, we're not just looking at monsters, right? We're looking at a distorted reflection of ourselves. We see glimpses of our own darkness, our own capacity for cruelty, and it both terrifies and compels us, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's like we're looking into a cracked mirror, right? Seeing a fragmented, distorted version of our own humanity. Which kind of brings us to this question. Can we stop them?
Right.
Like, is there any way to prevent these tragedies from happening?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer, but the book does highlight some promising developments in law enforcement and mental health.
Okay, so let's talk about those. What are some of the strategies that are being used to try and prevent these kinds of crimes? Like, what are we doing better now than, say, 50 years ago?
Well, for starters, behavioral profiling has become a much more sophisticated tool. FBI profilers can now analyze crime scenes, looking for patterns and clues that might reveal the killer's personality, habits, even their occupation. It's like creating a psychological fingerprint to help narrow down the search.
So it's not just about physical evidence anymore, right? We're trying to get inside the killer's head,
Exactly.
understand their motivations, predict their next move.
Yep. And then there's the incredible advancements in forensic science, especially DNA analysis.
Oh, yeah.
This has been a huge game changer in solving cold cases and bringing killers to justice,
Yeah.
even years, sometimes decades after the crimes were committed.
Yeah, it's like the walls are closing in, even for the ones who think they got away with it.
That's right. The technology is catching up. The evidence is becoming much harder to escape.
Right.
But perhaps the most crucial aspect of prevention lies in early intervention and mental health support.
Okay.
Identifying and treating individuals with violent tendencies at a young age, providing them with the resources and support they need, could potentially prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
So it's not just about catching them after the fact. It's about addressing the root causes of violence.
Yes.
And creating a more supportive environment for those who might be at risk.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach that involves law enforcement, mental health professionals, educators, and even families and communities working together to create a safety net.
It sounds like a very complex and challenging task.
It is, but ultimately it's worth it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And we have to be realistic. The rarity and unpredictability of serial killers makes prevention a constant challenge. There's no foolproof method, no guaranteed solution.
Well, that doesn't mean we give up, right?
Right.
Like, even if we can prevent just one tragedy,
Yeah.
save one life, that's got to be worth it.
Absolutely. Every life saved is a victory. And I think that's where the importance of this deep dive comes in. By understanding the complex factors that contribute to the making of a serial killer.
Yeah.
By dispelling myths and shedding light on the darkness, right, we can contribute to a more informed and proactive approach to prevention.
It's about empowering people with knowledge, right? Giving them the tools to recognize the warning signs, to seek help when needed,
Right.
and to advocate for better mental health resources in their communities.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
Right.
And in this case, it could be the power to save lives.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the role of the media in shaping our perceptions of serial killers.
Yeah.
You mentioned the danger of glorifying these individuals, of turning them into like anti-heroes or celebrities.
Right, and I think it's so important for all of us to be mindful of how we consume true crime content.
Yeah.
Are we seeking to understand and learn? Or are we simply indulging in morbid curiosity and sensationalism?
It's a fine line, isn't it? Because there's real value in exploring these cases,
Yeah.
learning from the past and understanding the psychology of violence. But we have to be careful not to cross that line into glorification or exploitation.
Absolutely. And that responsibility falls on creators, consumers, and the media as a whole.
So what can we do as individuals to be more responsible consumers of true crime? How can we engage with this content in a way that's both informative and ethical?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of the potential biases and agendas that might be present in the content we consume. Is the story being told with sensitivity and respect for the victims? Or is it sensationalized and exploitative?
Right, it's about asking critical questions,
Yeah.
not just passively absorbing the information,
Hmm.
but actively engaging with it, challenging it, and forming our own conclusions.
Exactly. And it's also about being mindful of the impact this content has on us. Does it leave us feeling informed and empowered? Or does it simply fuel our anxieties and fears?
It's about finding that balance between curiosity and compassion, between the desire to understand and the need to protect ourselves from becoming desensitized to violence.
And I think it's also about remembering the victims, their stories, their lives, their families who have suffered unimaginable loss.
Right.
They should be at the forefront of all minds as we engage with true crime content.
It's easy to get caught up in the psychology of the killer,
Yeah.
the intricacies of the investigation, all that. But we can't lose sight of the human cost of these crimes.
Right, because ultimately, these stories are not just about entertainment or morbid curiosity. They're about real people, real lives, and the devastating impact of violence.
And that brings us back to the question of prevention. Right?
Yeah.
Like, what can we as individuals do to create a safer world?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, educating ourselves about the warning signs of violence, understanding the risk factors, and being willing to speak up if we see something concerning.
It's about being proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And it's also about supporting organizations that are working to address these issues, whether it's through mental health services, victim advocacy, or criminal justice reform.
So it's a collective effort, really. Individuals, communities, and institutions working together to create a culture that values empathy, compassion, and early intervention.
Exactly. And while the problem of serial killers might seem insurmountable, I believe that by fostering those values, by shining a light on the darkness, we can make a real difference.
You know, as we've been discussing all of this, I've been struck by the fact that the book doesn't just focus on the darkness.
Right.
It also talks about the incredible resilience of the human spirit,
Yes.
the power of hope and healing, even in the face of unimaginable trauma.
That's such an important point because even in the darkest corners of human experience, there's always light to be found. There are always stories of survival, of courage, of people overcoming adversity and finding a way to rebuild their lives.
And those stories are just as important, if not more so, than the stories of the killers themselves.
Absolutely, because they remind us that even in the face of evil, humanity endures. And that, I think, is the ultimate message of hope.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in all the darkness when you're talking about this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's important to remember those stories of resilience. You know, it's a reminder that even though there's evil in the world, there's also hope. And the human spirit is super strong.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a good place to start as we kind of wrap up everything we've talked about today. It's been a pretty heavy deep dive.
It really has.
Yeah.
We've explored the psychology of serial killers, the biological factors, the different motives. We even talked about society's relationship with true crime and how the media can sometimes glorify these individuals.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. And, we even talked about some really big questions about free will and responsibility and the nature of evil, which are really tough to answer. There may not even be, definitive solutions. But I think the fact that we're even asking these questions and trying to understand the darkness is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's about shining a light on those shadows, right?
Yeah.
Understanding is the first step toward prevention.
Exactly. And speaking of prevention, we discussed some of the strategies that are being used, like behavioral profiling advancements in forensic science, and probably most importantly, early intervention and mental health support. Those are all huge.
Yeah, and it's not just about law enforcement or mental health professionals, right? Like, we all have a role to play.
Right.
As individuals, as communities, we can all contribute to creating a safer world.
Absolutely. It starts with awareness, educating ourselves about the warning signs, being willing to speak up if we see something concerning. It's about fostering empathy and compassion and creating a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help when they need it.
And being responsible consumers of true crime, right? Like remembering the victims, being critical of the narratives we see,
Mm.
and not letting ourselves become desensitized to the human cost of these crimes.
Really well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with? What are the things you really want them to remember?
I think the biggest one is that there's no easy answer for why someone becomes a serial killer. It's a mix of things: biological, psychological, social, environmental. And while we might never fully understand what pushes someone to do those things, we can keep learning and researching and working towards prevention.
I totally agree. And I also think it's important to remember that even though we've been talking about this dark side of human nature, there's still so much good in the world. There's hope, there's resilience, and there are tons of stories about people overcoming huge challenges and doing amazing things.
That's a good reminder, especially after a topic like this. So, to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the mind of a serial killer.
We hope this deep dive was informative and got you thinking.
And remember, even when things seem really dark, there's always light out there.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep trying to make the world a better place.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.